February 14, 1943. Faid Pass, Tunisia. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison crouched behind a destroyed half-track, watching German Panzer IV tanks roll toward his position at 25 miles per hour. Behind him, what remained of the 168th Infantry Regiment, perhaps 400 men from an original strength of 2,500, were trapped in a wadi with no anti-tank guns, no artillery support, and German armor closing from 3 directions. Morrison carried a weapon that looked ridiculous. A 5-foot steel tube that weighed 13 pounds and fired a 3.5-pound rocket. His battalion commander had called it a goddamn stovepipe when they'd been issued 2 of them 3 weeks earlier. German intelligence had dismissed reports of American tube rockets as Allied propaganda. No shoulder-fired weapon could threaten a tank protected by 50 millimeters of hardened steel armor. Morrison watched the lead Panzer approach to 75 yards. He raised the tube to his shoulder, aligned the crude wire sight on the tank side armor where it met the turret, and squeezed the electrical firing trigger. The rocket motor ignited with a flash and a roar. 1 second later, the shape-charge warhead struck the Panzer side at 265 feet per second and burned through the armor in a jet of superheated copper moving at 25,000 feet per second. The tank exploded from internal ammunition detonation. The following Panzers stopped, unable to comprehend what had just killed their lead vehicle. Before we reveal how a rocket scientist's 25-year-old idea stopped Germany's tank advantage, obliterate that subscribe button. Like and comment if you've heard of the bazooka. This channel exposes weapons that changed warfare forever. Now let me show you how a $40 weapon revolutionized infantry anti-tank combat. Robert Goddard was not a weapons designer by nature or ambition. Born on October 5, 1882, in Worcester, Massachusetts, he was a physics professor at Clark University who dreamed of spaceflight decades before anyone else took the idea seriously. By 1918, he had already filed numerous patents on rocket propulsion systems, liquid fuel rockets, and multi-stage designs that would not be fully appreciated until the space age. But in 1918, there was no space program. There was only the Great War consuming Europe, and the United States military was desperately seeking any technology that might break the stalemate of trench warfare. Goddard, like many scientists, felt obligated to contribute to the war effort even if it meant setting aside his space dreams temporarily. The problem the Army presented to Goddard was both simple and seemingly impossible. Infantry attacking across no man's land were being slaughtered by machine guns positioned in concrete bunkers and fortified positions. Artillery could destroy these positions, but required extensive fire missions that gave defenders warning. What the Army needed was a weapon that individual soldiers could carry and use to destroy fortifications at close range. Something more powerful than grenades but more portable than artillery. Goddard's solution was characteristically elegant. If you could miniaturize a rocket motor and attach a small explosive warhead, you could give infantry their own portable artillery. The rocket would provide propulsion without the recoil problems of conventional guns. The explosive warhead would provide destructive power. And the entire system could theoretically be light enough for one man to carry and operate. Goddard developed 2 prototype weapons at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California during the final months of World War I. The first was a tube-launched rocket that a soldier could fire from the shoulder. The second was a handheld rocket launcher that worked like a recoilless rifle. Both weapons used solid-fuel rocket motors that Goddard had designed specifically for military applications. The tube-launched version was particularly promising. A simple steel tube open at both ends with a basic sighting mechanism. Load the rocket from the rear, aim, fire, and the rocket motor would ignite inside the tube, launching the projectile toward the target. The open rear of the tube would vent the rocket exhaust harmlessly behind the operator, eliminating recoil. It was so simple that Goddard later admitted he was surprised no one had thought of it before. The Army tested Goddard's prototypes at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland on November 6, 1918. The demonstrations were successful beyond expectations. The tube-launched rocket could reach targets 60 to 70 yards away with reasonable accuracy. The explosive warhead, while small, was powerful enough to damage fortifications and certainly lethal to personnel. Army Ordnance officers watched Goddard fire his prototype and immediately recognized its potential. This was exactly what they had been seeking. A weapon that could give infantry anti-fortification capability without requiring heavy equipment or specialized artillery training. They recommended immediate adoption and began planning for mass production. Then, on November 11, 1918, the armistice ended World War I. The massive military contracts vanished overnight. The urgency to develop new weapons disappeared. Goddard's rocket tube was filed away in military archives as interesting but no longer necessary. For the next 20 years, Goddard returned to his real passion, designing rockets for spaceflight. He built and tested the world's first liquid-fuel rocket in 1926, launching it from his aunt's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. He developed gyroscopic guidance systems, fuel pumps, and combustion chamber designs that would later be used in the German V-2 rocket and eventually in American space programs. He secured hundreds of patents. He worked largely in obscurity, funded by small grants and occasionally by the Guggenheim family who believed in his vision. The military showed occasional interest in his work, but nothing substantial. Rockets were seen as laboratory curiosities, not practical weapons. Meanwhile, in Europe, German tank development was accelerating at a pace that would soon terrify the world. By 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to tanks. Poland fell in 35 days. France, with the world's largest army, collapsed in 6 weeks. The German Panzer divisions moved so fast that traditional anti-tank defenses, fortified positions, large-caliber artillery, and static defensive lines, proved useless. The problem was not that Allied forces lacked anti-tank weapons. They had plenty of anti-tank guns, some quite effective. The problem was that anti-tank guns weighed 800 to 2,000 pounds, required vehicle towing to position, and took precious minutes to set up and aim. By the time defenders identified a tank threat and positioned their guns, German armor had already bypassed them or destroyed them with combined arms tactics. What infantry desperately needed was a portable anti-tank weapon they could carry into battle and fire immediately from wherever they happened to be. The United States Army, watching Europe burn, recognized that American infantry would eventually face German tanks and that current American anti-tank weapons were inadequate. The standard infantry anti-tank weapon in 1940 was the M137mm anti-tank gun, a respectable weapon that could penetrate 50mm of armor at 500 yards. But it weighed 912 pounds and required a 6-man crew to operate effectively. If German tanks overran an infantry position, those crews were as good as dead. The Army's Ordnance Department began researching portable anti-tank weapons, and someone remembered Robert Goddard's 1918 rocket tube sitting in the archives. In May 1940, Army Ordnance officers contacted Goddard and asked if his old design could be adapted to defeat tank armor. Goddard, now 58 years old and in declining health, agreed to consult on the project. The challenge was formidable. Tank armor in 1940 was far thicker than anything Goddard had dealt with in 1918. The German Panzer IV, which would become the workhorse of German armored divisions, had 50mm of frontal armor and 30mm on the sides, enough to stop conventional high-explosive shells of the size that could be fired from a shoulder-mounted launcher. Goddard's original rocket warhead design would barely scratch such armor. What the Army needed was something called a shaped charge or hollow charge warhead. This technology, discovered independently by researchers in several countries during the 1930s, exploited a curious physical phenomenon. If you lined a hollow explosive charge with metal, usually copper, and detonated it in a specific configuration, the explosive force would compress the metal liner into a high-velocity jet moving at speeds exceeding 20,000 feet per second. This jet could burn through steel armor far thicker than conventional explosives could penetrate. Swiss researcher Henry Mohaupt had developed practical shaped charge ammunition and brought his designs to the United States in 1940. The Army's Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia was already working on shaped charge rifle grenades when Goddard's old rocket tube design was resurrected from the archives. In early 1941, someone had the brilliant idea to combine Mohaupt's shaped charge warhead with Goddard's rocket tube launcher. The result would be a weapon that could fire a tank-killing warhead from a simple shoulder-mounted tube. Captain Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Ewell at Aberdeen Proving Ground were assigned to develop this combination into a functional weapon. They worked fast. By May 1942, they had a working prototype. It was crude, experimental, and looked ridiculous. A 54-inch steel tube with simple wire sights and an electrical firing mechanism. But it worked. The M1 rocket launcher, as it was officially designated, could fire a 3.4-pound rocket with a shape-charge warhead to effective ranges of 150 to 300 yards. The warhead could penetrate 3 inches of armor plate, which meant it could punch through the side or rear armor of any German tank then in service, and even threaten the frontal armor of lighter tanks. The launcher tube itself weighed just 13 pounds empty, meaning a single soldier could carry it along with several rockets. The firing procedure was simple enough that a soldier could be trained to operate it in an afternoon. Load a rocket into the rear of the tube. Connect the electrical firing wire to the battery-powered firing mechanism. Aim using the wire sights. Squeeze the trigger. The rocket motor would ignite, sending the rocket down the tube and toward the target. The open rear of the tube vented the rocket exhaust, creating a dangerous backblast zone but eliminating recoil that would have made shoulder firing impossible. The weapon received its famous nickname through pure accident. During demonstration firing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in June 1942, a visiting musician and comedian named Bob Burns observed the weapon being tested. Burns was famous for playing a homemade musical instrument he called a bazooka, a crude wind instrument made from pipes and a whiskey funnel that produced ridiculous sounds for comedy routines. When Burns saw soldiers firing the rocket launcher, he reportedly laughed and said it looked like his bazooka. The name stuck immediately. Within weeks, soldiers were calling the M1 rocket launcher the bazooka, and the official designation was largely forgotten. The Army didn't fight the nickname. In fact, they embraced it. Bazooka was easier to say than M1 rocket launcher, and it had a distinctly American informal quality that fit the weapon's no-nonsense design. Production began immediately at General Electric's facility in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with additional contracts going to Cheney-Bigelow Wire Works. The weapon was so simple to manufacture that production scaled up rapidly. Each launcher cost approximately $40 to produce, less than a single anti-tank mine and a fraction of the cost of a conventional anti-tank gun. By October 1942, when American forces prepared for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, thousands of bazookas had been produced and distributed to infantry units. Most soldiers had never seen the weapon before. Training was minimal. Many units received their bazookas only days before boarding ships for North Africa. Some didn't receive them until after landing. The weapon was so new that doctrine for its employment barely existed. Units were told it could destroy tanks and were given basic firing instructions. Everything else would have to be figured out in combat. The first combat use of the bazooka came on November 8, 1942, during the initial landings of Operation Torch. American forces landing at Oran and Algiers faced Vichy French defenders who had some obsolete tanks in service. Several bazooka teams engaged these tanks successfully, proving that the weapon worked in combat conditions. But Vichy French resistance collapsed quickly, and these early engagements didn't really test the weapon against determined opposition or modern armor. The real test would come in Tunisia, where American forces would face the Afrika Korps and discover just how dangerous German armor tactics really were. Tunisia was where American soldiers would learn to fight, and where the bazooka would prove whether it was a legitimate anti-tank weapon or an expensive piece of junk. The Tunisia campaign began in November 1942 and quickly became a brutal education for American forces. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, retreating from Egypt after defeat at El Alamein, was reinforcing Tunisia with experienced Afrika Korps units that had been fighting in the desert for 2 years. American troops, mostly inexperienced and poorly coordinated, advanced into eastern Tunisia expecting quick victory. Instead, they ran into German defenses at the Faid Pass in February 1943 and suffered a devastating defeat. German tanks, mainly Panzer III and Panzer IV models, smashed through American positions, destroying entire units and capturing hundreds of prisoners. American anti-tank defenses proved woefully inadequate. The 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate German frontal armor reliably. Infantry without anti-tank weapons could only run or surrender when tanks appeared. But scattered throughout the American units were small numbers of soldiers carrying bazookas, and these teams began learning how to use them effectively through trial and error. The weapon had significant limitations that only combat could reveal. Effective range was much shorter than advertised, realistically about 100 yards for a reasonable hit probability, far less than the 300 yards that training manuals claimed. The rocket was not particularly accurate, with a trajectory that dropped noticeably at longer ranges and a tendency to drift in crosswinds. The shape-charge warhead, while capable of penetrating armor, would only detonate properly if it hit the target at the correct angle. A glancing hit might damage the tank's exterior equipment but fail to penetrate. And most critically, the backblast from the rocket motor made the weapon's position immediately obvious to any enemy within visual range. Fire the bazooka, and every German soldier nearby now knew exactly where you were. Successful bazooka engagements required getting close to tanks without being seen, hitting vulnerable spots like side or rear armor, and immediately relocating after firing before German infantry could respond. This was not the kind of combat that training manuals covered. This was learned by men who survived their first encounter and could teach others what worked. By late February 1943, small unit tactics for bazooka employment were beginning to emerge from battlefield experience. Teams learned to work in pairs, one soldier carrying the launcher, another carrying extra rockets and providing security. They learned to position themselves in defilade, using terrain features that concealed them until tanks were close enough for effective shots. They learned to aim for track assemblies, engine compartments, and turret rings where armor was thinner or where mechanical damage might disable the tank even if penetration failed. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison of the 168th Infantry Regiment, 34th Infantry Division, had never fired a bazooka before landing in North Africa in November 1942. His regiment had received 6 bazookas 3 weeks before deployment, with minimal instruction beyond basic firing procedures. Morrison, commanding a weapons platoon, assigned 2 bazookas to his unit and hoped he would never need to use them. By February 1943, after fighting through Tunisia's mountains and valleys, Morrison had become an expert through necessity. He had knocked out 2 Italian tankettes and damaged a German armored car. He had learned that the weapon was most effective at ranges under 50 yards, where accuracy was better and armor penetration was more reliable. He had learned that tank crews often couldn't see infantrymen positioned low to the ground, especially in broken terrain. And he had learned that hitting a tank with a bazooka required calm nerves and steady hands, because if you missed, the tank would definitely shoot back. On February 14, 1943, German forces launched Operation Frühlingswind, a major offensive designed to destroy American units before they could threaten Rommel's defensive line. The main thrust came through Faid Pass, a gap in the mountains where American forces had established defensive positions. The 168th Infantry Regiment held the pass, spread thin across a wide sector, with little armor support and inadequate artillery. German intelligence estimated the American position could be overrun quickly by combined tank and infantry assault. At 0400 hours, German armor elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer divisions began moving through the darkness toward Faid Pass. They had approximately 140 tanks, including 50 Panzer IV models with 75mm guns and frontal armor thick enough to stop most American anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. The plan was to smash through the American defenses before dawn, then exploit into the Allied rear areas. Morrison's platoon occupied a position on a small ridge overlooking one of the approaches to the pass. He had 43 men, 3 machine guns, 1 mortar, and 2 bazookas with 8 rockets between them. When German armor appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison counted at least 15 tanks moving toward his position. Standard doctrine said infantry without anti-tank guns should withdraw when facing armor. But Morrison's regiment was already surrounded, with German tanks cutting off retreat routes. He could withdraw into the wadi behind his position and be trapped there when German infantry followed the tanks, or he could fight from the ridge and hope the bazookas could do something useful. He ordered his men to hold position and prepare to engage armor at close range. This was either courage or stupidity, and Morrison wasn't sure which. The lead Panzer IV approached to within 75 yards before Morrison fired. He aimed at the junction where the turret met the hull, a known weak point where armor was thinner and penetration was more likely. The rocket motor ignited with its characteristic roar and flash. The rocket flew relatively straight, luck as much as skill at that range, and struck exactly where Morrison had aimed. The shape-charge warhead detonated, and the copper jet burned through the armor in microseconds. Inside the tank, the jet struck ammunition stowage. The Panzer IV exploded from internal detonation, blowing the turret off and killing the crew instantly. The following tanks stopped immediately, unable to identify where the fire had come from. German tank commanders had encountered American 37mm anti-tank guns before and knew their sound and muzzle flash. This was different. The flash came from ground level, not from a gun position. The explosion was wrong. This didn't match any weapon they had encountered before. Morrison's 2nd Bazooka Team, positioned 30 yards to his left, fired at the next tank in line. The rocket struck the Panzer's track assembly, detonating against the road wheels and blowing the track off. The tank was mobility killed, unable to move but still capable of firing. His turret began traversing, searching for targets. Morrison's machine guns opened fire on the disabled tank, not expecting to penetrate armor but hoping to suppress the crew and prevent accurate return fire. The remaining German tanks began backing away, commanders realizing they were in a kill zone against weapons they didn't understand. 2 tanks destroyed or disabled within 30 seconds was unacceptable loss rate. German tank doctrine emphasized preserving armor for decisive engagements, not sacrificing tanks against unknown threats. The Panzers withdrew approximately 400 yards and regrouped, waiting for infantry to move forward and identify the American positions. This was exactly what Morrison had hoped for. Time. Every minute the German tanks spent repositioning was another minute for American forces to organize defenses or attempt withdrawal. His platoon had 6 rockets remaining between 2 bazookas. If the Germans came again with infantry support, Morrison's position would be overrun. But he had proven something important. The bazooka, when properly employed at close range against vulnerable points, could kill German tanks. The weapon that ordnance officers had rushed into production based on limited testing actually worked in combat. Morrison didn't know it, but his engagement was being watched by battalion and regimental commanders through binoculars from positions further back. They were seeing firsthand that American infantry finally had a weapon that could fight tanks. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical success. Soldiers who knew they could hurt enemy tanks would stand and fight rather than panic and run. The German armor returned 40 minutes later with infantry support, and this time Morrison's position was overrun within 20 minutes. His platoon inflicted casualties and disabled 1 more tank before being forced to withdraw into the Wadi, where they were eventually surrounded and captured along with most of the 168th Infantry Regiment. Morrison would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner, but the action report from Faid Pass, compiled from survivors' accounts and German after-action reports captured later in the campaign, documented multiple successful bazooka engagements. American infantry, when armed with bazookas and properly positioned, could engage German armor with at least some prospect of success. This was revolutionary. For the first time since 1940, infantry had a portable weapon that gave them offensive capability against tanks. German intelligence took immediate notice of the bazooka once captured examples were examined in detail. Initial reports dismissed it as crude and unreliable, typical American engineering that prioritized mass production over precision. But when German ordnance experts tested captured bazookas and examined the shape-charge warheads, they realized this simple tube weapon represented a genuine threat to German armor superiority. Reports sent to Berlin in March 1943 warned that the American rocket launcher could penetrate the side and rear armor of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks at ranges up to 100 meters. Recommendations included increasing armor thickness, particularly on side skirts and engine decks, and developing countermeasures. These reports would eventually influence German tank design, leading to add-on armor plates and the development of Germany's own anti-tank rocket launchers, the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust by April 1943. As the Tunisia campaign entered its final phase, bazookas were being distributed throughout American infantry units at scale. The weapon was no longer experimental equipment issued to a few units. It was standard infantry armament. Every rifle company received at least 2 bazookas with doctrinal guidelines for their employment. Training improved as combat veterans rotated back to instruction duties and taught lessons learned in actual engagements. Soldiers learned that effective bazooka tactics required patience, concealment, and nerve. You let the tank get close, sometimes uncomfortably close, before firing. You aimed for vulnerable spots, not heavily armored frontal plates. You fired and immediately relocated because the backblast signature revealed your position. And you accepted that sometimes the rocket would miss, malfunction, or fail to penetrate, and you would need to rely on luck and terrain to survive the tank's response. The Sicily invasion in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian campaign provided additional testing grounds for bazooka tactics. American and German forces fought through mountainous terrain where tanks had to advance along predictable routes, often roads that wound through valleys with steep sides. This terrain favored infantry with anti-tank weapons who could position themselves on high ground and engage armor from above, where top armor was typically thinnest. Bazooka teams learned to set ambushes at choke points, destroying lead tanks to block narrow roads and trap following vehicles. German tank commanders began to recognize areas where bazooka ambushes were likely and requested infantry support before advancing through such terrain. The presence of bazookas was forcing changes in German tactical doctrine, requiring more caution and consuming time that German forces could not afford. The weapon's effectiveness increased dramatically with the introduction of the M1A1 and later M9 improved models. The M1A1, introduced in late 1943, featured better sights, improved electrical firing mechanism, and reinforced tube construction that reduced malfunctions. The M9, introduced in 1944, incorporated lessons from 2 years of combat experience. It broke down into 2 sections for easier transport, featured an optical sight that improved accuracy, and used an improved rocket with better propellant that reduced smoke signature. These improvements made the bazooka more reliable and more lethal, but the fundamental design remained Goddard's original concept: a simple tube that used rocket propulsion to launch a shaped charge warhead. What changed was manufacturing quality and operational doctrine built from combat experience. By 1944, American forces preparing for the invasion of France carried bazookas as standard infantry equipment. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 saw bazooka teams assigned to every rifle company with specific roles in the assault plan. Once infantry pushed inland from the beaches, they would inevitably encounter German armor, and bazookas would be the first line of defense until heavier anti-tank weapons could be brought forward. The hedgerow country of Normandy provided ideal terrain for bazooka ambushes. The thick vegetation and high earthen banks that surrounded every field created natural concealment for infantry. German tanks advancing through this terrain were blind to infantry positioned behind hedgerows. Bazooka teams could wait until tanks passed their position, then hit them from the side or rear at point-blank range. German tankers in Normandy learned to fear movement through hedgerow country. Tank commanders described it as advancing through a maze where every corner might conceal American infantry with rockets. German after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly mention losses to American Panzer weapons. They were using the German term for their own similar weapon because they had no other frame of reference for shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets. The psychological impact on German armor crews was significant. Tank commanders who would aggressively advance in open terrain became cautious and hesitant when operating in hedgerows. This caution slowed German counterattacks and gave American forces time to consolidate positions after the initial landings. The bazooka didn't win the Battle of Normandy, but it contributed to American infantry's ability to hold ground against German armored counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested the bazooka under the worst possible conditions. German armor attacking in winter conditions through the Ardennes forest caught American forces by surprise and often surrounded them in small groups. Infantry units found themselves fighting defensive battles without artillery support or anti-tank gun support, armed only with rifles, machine guns, and bazookas. At Bastogne, American paratroopers surrounded by German armor relied heavily on bazookas to defend against tank attacks. The frozen ground limited tank mobility, channeling German armor onto roads where bazooka teams could engage from prepared positions. The cold weather created problems for the weapon. Batteries for the electrical firing mechanism became less reliable, and soldiers had to keep spare batteries warm inside their uniforms. But the weapon continued to function, and Bastogne's defenders knocked out or disabled numerous German tanks with bazooka fire throughout the siege. The Pacific theater presented different challenges for bazooka employment. Japanese armor was generally lighter and less sophisticated than German tanks, but Japanese defensive tactics often placed tanks in concealed positions where they could ambush American forces at close range. The bazooka proved devastatingly effective against Japanese light tanks and medium tanks, whose armor was thinner than comparable German vehicles. More importantly, the bazooka was effective against Japanese fortifications, the bunkers and pillboxes that Japanese forces built extensively on islands throughout the Pacific. The shaped charge warhead, designed to penetrate tank armor, could also blast through the reinforced concrete and coconut log construction of Japanese defensive positions. Marine and Army units in the Pacific used bazookas as much for bunker busting as for anti-tank work, often firing multiple rockets into firing ports to collapse fortifications or kill defenders inside. Robert Goddard did not live to see the full impact of his weapon design. He died on August 10, 1945, 4 days before Japan's surrender, from throat cancer at age 62. His obituaries focused primarily on his pioneering rocket research and his vision of spaceflight. The bazooka was mentioned as a wartime contribution, but most accounts treated it as a footnote to his more significant work on liquid fuel rockets and guidance systems. Goddard himself had never promoted his military weapons work, considering it a distraction from his real passion. He had consulted on the bazooka's development but had not been directly involved in the combat refinements that made it effective. The weapon that bore his conceptual fingerprints had been transformed by military necessity and combat experience into something beyond his original 1918 vision. By the end of World War II, American industry had produced approximately 476,000 bazooka launchers of all models and roughly 15 million rockets. The weapon had been distributed to every infantry unit in the American military and had been supplied through Lend-Lease to Allied forces including British, Free French, Soviet, and Chinese units. Post-war analysis credited the bazooka with destroying or disabling thousands of enemy tanks and fortifications, though precise numbers are impossible to calculate. More importantly, the weapon had changed infantry tactics fundamentally. Infantry that could engage armor with portable weapons would fight differently than infantry that could only run when tanks appeared. The bazooka had given ordinary soldiers offensive capability against the most powerful weapons on the battlefield, and that psychological shift was as important as any tactical advantage. The Soviet Union, which received bazookas through Lend-Lease, studied the weapon carefully and developed their own copies and improvements. The Germans, facing bazookas in North Africa, Sicily, and France, developed the Panzer, a larger version of the bazooka that fired an 88mm rocket with greater penetration capability. Later they developed the Panzerfaust, a simpler disposable launcher that was cheaper to produce and easier to use. Britain developed the PIAT, a different approach using a spring-powered spigot mortar, but the concept remained the same: give infantry portable anti-tank capability. The bazooka had started an arms race in infantry anti-tank weapons that would continue throughout the Cold War and beyond. Every modern anti-tank guided missile, from the American TOW to the Soviet RPG series, traces its conceptual lineage back to Goddard's simple tube launcher. American forces continued using bazookas in Korea, where they proved effective against North Korean T-34 tanks in the war's opening months. By Vietnam, the bazooka was being replaced by more modern weapons like the M72 Law and the Dragon missile system, but the fundamental concept, a shoulder-fired tube launching a shaped charge projectile, remained unchanged. Modern infantry anti-tank weapons are far more sophisticated than Goddard's original design, with guidance systems, longer range, and greater penetration capability. But they all work on the same basic principle that Goddard conceived in 1918 and that American soldiers proved in Tunisia in 1943. Infantry needs portable anti-tank weapons, and the simplest effective design is a tube, a rocket, and a shaped charge warhead. The legacy of the bazooka extends far beyond its World War II service record. The weapon fundamentally changed how military planners thought about infantry capability and force structure. Before the bazooka, infantry required specialized anti-tank units equipped with heavy-towed guns to engage armor. These units were separate from rifle companies and required vehicle transport to position their weapons. The organizational complexity meant that infantry often found themselves facing tanks without anti-tank support because the specialized units were positioned elsewhere. The bazooka integrated anti-tank capability directly into rifle companies, eliminating the organizational gap between infantry and anti-tank defense. Every infantry unit now had organic anti-tank capability that could be employed immediately without waiting for specialized support. This integration influenced post-war military organization across NATO forces. The concept that infantry should have organic anti-tank weapons became standard doctrine. American forces developed successive generations of shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, each improving on the bazooka's basic design. The M20 Super Bazooka, introduced in 1950, fired a larger 3.5-inch rocket with greater penetration. The M72 law, adopted in 1963, was a disposable launcher that soldiers could use once and discard. The Dragon missile, introduced in 1975, added wire guidance for greater accuracy. The Javelin, adopted in 1996, added fire-and-forget guidance and top-attack capability. Each generation was more sophisticated and more lethal, but each traced its lineage directly to Goddard's 1918 tube launcher that Captain Skinner and Lieutenant Ewell had resurrected from the archives in 1941. The simplicity that made the bazooka effective in 1943 remains relevant in modern conflicts. Insurgent and irregular forces worldwide have employed shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons precisely because they are simple to use, easy to transport, and effective against armored vehicles. The Soviet RPG-7, introduced in 1961, operates on the same basic principle as the bazooka and has become one of the most widely distributed weapons in history, with an estimated 9 million produced. Its effectiveness against American vehicles in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrates that the fundamental concept Goddard pioneered, a simple tube launching a rocket-propelled shaped charge, remains viable even against modern composite armor and active protection systems. Technology has advanced enormously, but physics and geometry remain constant. The human cost and benefit of the bazooka is impossible to calculate precisely but was certainly significant. How many American soldiers survived tank encounters because they had bazookas instead of only rifles and grenades? How many German tanks were destroyed by infantry who could engage armor instead of retreating or surrendering? The weapon didn't win the war. Industrial production, strategic bombing, and the Eastern Front decided that outcome. But it gave infantry a fighting chance against armor, and that psychological shift mattered. Soldiers who believe they can defend themselves will hold positions that soldiers without hope will abandon. The bazooka provided that hope and that capability at a critical moment when American forces were learning to fight German armor and needed every advantage they could get. The story of the bazooka is ultimately about how simple solutions to complex problems can emerge from unexpected sources. A rocketry pioneer working on spaceflight concepts in 1918 created a weapon design that military planners resurrected 23 years later out of desperation. Engineers simplified and refined the design. Combat soldiers figured out how to use it effectively under fire. The result was a weapon that cost $40 to produce, weighed 13 pounds, required minimal training to operate, and could destroy tanks that cost tens of thousands of dollars and required years to produce. This was American industrial warfare at its most efficient, identifying a problem, finding the simplest effective solution, and scaling production to equip every soldier who needed it. Robert Goddard's 1918 tube launcher, dismissed as unnecessary when World War I ended, proved essential when World War II began. The simple steel tube that soldiers called a bazooka because it looked like a comedian's musical instrument became one of the most important infantry weapons of the 20th century. It didn't replace artillery or tank destroyers. It didn't make infantry invincible against armor. But it gave ordinary soldiers the ability to fight back against tanks. And sometimes that was the difference between holding a position and losing it. From Tunisia's mountains to Normandy's hedgerows to Bastogne frozen forests, American soldiers carried their bazookas and knew that when German tanks appeared, they weren't helpless. They had a tube, a rocket, and a chance. And in war, sometimes a chance is all you need. Goddard's vision of rockets reaching space eventually came true decades after his death. But his simpler vision of rockets helping infantry survive came true much sooner, and saved lives he never knew about in battles he never witnessed. That legacy, unintended but profound, might be the most important contribution he made beyond his dreams of the stars.